This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-recognized writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Good morning, Charles, and welcome back to Macro Analytics.
Thank you, Gordon.
The last time we talked, we were discussing the Federal Reserve in a two-part series. We tried to show it as maybe a less visible element that is contributing to this steady migration that is occurring towards increasing levels of what you and I have termed as statism. We've discussed previously the more visible element of social unrest, shown here on the bottom of this chart, but I thought this morning we would talk about the increasing pressures on our founding principles of our Constitution and our constitutional rights, because they're clearly contributing here to this roadmap and this migration to statism. I have a quote that I thought was really important that we front-end this discussion this morning. This quote was written in 1912 by von Mises, and to quote it, it says, "It is impossible to grasp the meaning of the idea of sound money if one does not realize that it was devised as an instrument for the protection of civil liberties against despotic inroads on the part of governments. Ideologically, it belongs in the same class with political constitutions and Bill of Rights." Charles, I can't stress that strong enough, that the whole concept of sound money is not just economics. It's a way of constraining governments, constraining politicians, even constraining the public demands of social benefits. Because without it, and as we did in 1971, we took ourselves off the gold standard. We, in fact, put ourselves on this road of unsound money, and all of the things that we've been discussing over the last many months are really a function of unsound money.
That's an excellent point, Gordon, and I think that that point is not well understood, the connection between what we might call the economic aspect of monetary policy and our political freedoms. They're not disconnected. They're completely connected.
Every time that we have disconnected, Charles, and this chart shows it here, it has led to the kinds of social unrest and situations that put people in power that took countries and nations in the wrong directions. I'm not suggesting that's what's going to happen here, but we're setting ourselves up for something that we may not like and where it ends. And there's a whole series of reasons that I'm showing here of why you need to have sound money. And to get into the points that I wanted to talk about more this morning with that as a context, I don't know if everybody's seen or understand the amount of executive orders that we're now starting to issue. And when executive orders are needed, the president needs to write these for various reasons. But as you can see, what was considered a very odd exception has now got to be, without question, standard practice, which is a way of end running the Congress, the House and the Senate, which is our body to have a check and a balance within our system. And so what are these executive orders? What are they? And I just pulled up some of them that are listed here. Some of them are so secret we're not allowed to look at. Most of them are, in fact, open to the public. And when you go through them, they're terrifying, to say the least, to look at the sums of the things that I don't know about you, Charles, but it looks like we're setting up for a police state when you read these. Isn't that what you read into this?
Yeah, Gordon, I have read several of these executive orders that are extremely broad in the power that they're grabbing. To my mind, I'm not an attorney. I don't claim to have a constitutional law background, but they appear to be completely extra legal. In other words, they are legal in the limited sense that the president has the right to issue an executive order, but they may very well be illegitimate, because they run counter to the Constitution.
I read into them that, in fact, they are counter to the Constitution. And at a minimum, Charles, they should be something that are debated by our elected officials in a group. the House and the Senate before some of these things are, in fact, approved. Assuming the president is doing the best thing for the American people, what it begs the question to me, and we were talking before we began, is why does he feel that these things are needed? Why does he feel so strongly that we need to be doing this? Because as good as intentioned they may be, you put the wrong set of people in power and they've got a switch that they can flip and suddenly, instantaneously, Charles, we have a police state. I'm not saying that's what's being set up to happen, but that's what is suddenly available. The switch is in place.
Precisely. And that switch is what's against the Constitution, because this switch of these executive powers, it bypasses Congress, it bypasses the Supreme Court and our judicial system entirely. And so you have to ask, how is this constitutional if it bypasses the balance of powers that the Constitution establishes?
Well, this is our theme here this morning, Charles, because it's what I'm referring to as constitutional pressures. When you get unsound money and you start to flow towards statism and higher levels of central planning, certain things happen. They're forced to happen. They're pressures to creating stability or creating the change or trying to protect infrastructure. These things become challenged, and that's clearly what we're starting to see right now in terms of these executive orders. But I started to list, Charles, I have this slide up here now, just some of the items, and I just listed 7 of them that I'm seeing front and center here in the last few weeks in my kinds of readings. And all of these are begging the same kinds of questions. Why are we doing this? And I understand the war on terror, but I think we're crossing some major lines on our constitutional rights, and certainly the principles of the basis and the intent of our Constitution. I mean, look at this, this Utah data mining facility. I thought we had rights to information and it was only allowed to be kept for a certain period of time once it was authorized. We're setting up this data mining where this data will be kept permanently. All of the information on every civilian and American citizen in the country. And this is a massive center that we're setting up in Utah. The restrictions on offshore accounts that we're doing under the auspices of taxes, of making sure everybody's paying their fair share of taxes. But on the other hand, what we're doing is we're getting more and more information and actually restricting Americans' abilities to invest offshore, frankly. This whole discussion on the internet, we've said basically what we have here is a kill switch. That at any given time we can turn off the internet. If we ever have a cyber attack, I understand the exposure, but at the same time we can turn that switch right off, and suddenly if the United Nations has its way where it wants to tax the internet, suddenly what we're allowed to get, how we're allowed to get it, and what we pay for it in itself could completely change the whole concept of the internet, all under the auspices of trying to protect ourselves from a cyber attack. The Patriot Act. The militarization of local police. I was reading about these new FEMA graduates. We're graduating 250 at a time now between the ages of 18 and 24 young men. And these are combat ready. I would look at them as rangers, but they're FEMA to be able to be dispatched anywhere in the country. Is this to help in an emergency? Why are we training them at this level of military ability to kill? Are we that concerned about looting that we need this level? I don't know. I'm not trying to draw any conclusions here, Charles, as I go through this, but I was reading just this morning this NCT's, this National Counterterrorism Center, what they call their disposition matrix. That's a fancy way of saying is kill lists. So that how they put people on these kill lists, it can be an American, living anywhere in the world, and on United States soil. When they're on that list, they'll kill you. And so they use the drones to actually obliterate a human being without due law. We used to say, no matter what, if a terrorist was found in the world, we'd bring him to justice. The justice now is from 30,000 feet with a missile. Is this as alarming to you as it is to me?
Absolutely. Because what we're talking about is due process. And we're talking about something that there should be sharp lines around that define civil liberties. And what we're talking about is blurring of those things. that your rights as a citizen are now blurred, because if you're labeled a bad guy by an organization over which there's no citizen control, then you can be assassinated, basically, because your name showed up on the wrong list, and without any judicial process or even oversight. That should be frightening.
Well, our Constitution says that you're innocent till proven guilty, and there shouldn't even be such a thing as a list. You go to court as a free man, and you're charged under a law, and you have the right to defend yourself before, in fact, you're found guilty. That's irrelevant nowadays, isn't it? Whoever's creating lists have the rights to make decisions. That's what's going on here. I know that you brought a list of things that you find the same way are somewhat troubling, and I have it up here now, Charles.
We were talking about the connection between our unsound money, fiat currency, and the emerging police state. And I just wanted to make a few points that we all kind of intuitively understand. The boiling frog, in which the frog is placed in the pot of water, and the temperature's increased slowly enough that the frog doesn't realize that he's getting boiled. And that's how the erosion of civil liberties feels to me, that this constant stream of dozens and even hundreds of executive orders which erode our civil liberties, but in abstract ways, so that people feel overwhelmed. They're numbed by it. They don't even understand what's going on. And part of this is that as their own financial situation worsens and their financial stress increases, they set aside their mind share for things like civil liberties shrinks. They just they're worried about paying their bills, and so that gives the government leeway actually to erode civil liberties without a lot of resistance. As you mentioned, the data collection, really troubling to me that in the recent past, intelligence and law enforcement were about locating people of interest, i.e. Potential suspects, and then getting a court order to set up surveillance on those people, gather evidence, and then if a crime has been, there's some evidence of criminal activity, then they can be arrested and the judicial process moves forward. Now we're trawling information on all communications of all citizens in the whole United States, and so they're basically changing the whole idea of intelligence and law enforcement. And people go, well, that can't happen here. We have a democracy and so on. But it already has happened here. The FBI in the COINTELPRO campaign against the anti-war movement in the 1960s and early 1970s set up all kinds of banana republic dictatorship type programs where they infiltrated organizations and had thugs beat up people, apparently street criminals, but they were actually government agents. That kind of thing that we would associate with like fascist government did happen. And now we have the Espionage Act, another one of these broad extra legal laws that can be used to suppress whistleblowers that are trying to, release the truth to the American public. The tax surveillance, we all understand, that we don't want tax evaders to get away from paying what we pay. But you have to ask, where are the limits of government actions in terms of personal finance? Could they confiscate gold, private gold, as they did in 1933? Could they mandate that all of our 401k retirement funds must be invested in treasuries? The point is that that the rules seem to be changing without due process, and that they can be changed overnight, and we have no feedback. We have no say in what happens. I mean, that should be frightening in itself.
Charles, why do you think all these things are happening? What's underlying it? Besides, I believe, unsound money. Is there some kind of master plan in place here?
Gordon, I don't know, but I do know that the system is becoming increasingly fragile, and presumably those people with access to intelligence and information, maybe they're sensing the fragility of the whole status quo, and so they're trying to grab as much power as possible now in order to respond in some sort of politically expedient way to future crises.
Well, if they believe there's a financial crisis that's on the horizon, these are possibly the kinds of things that they would be doing to prepare for it. I just did a whole series of tapes and discussions on the seminal event that occurred in September. And I'm not referring to QE3 unlimited or uncapped OMT in Europe, as big as they were, and they are seminal. I'm talking about the escalation of the currency wars, and that is the shift of China and Russia now exchanging all goods and services not in U.S. dollars. And now with 11 major agreements that have now been orchestrated by half of China, that the $7 trillion of U.S. dollars that now float out there as the world's reserve currency are not needed as much because trade for energy and a large amount of goods and services no longer need to be transacted in the United States dollars. And additionally, the United States is no longer the world's biggest exporter where people could only buy our goods and services in U.S. dollars. They're not, in fact, buying our goods and services. So this element of $7 trillion is some of that is going to, which is 60%, by the way, is of our $7 trillion is offshore in these accounts. Some element's going to come back to the United States. And if it was only 55% or 50%, that is hyperinflation of a phenomenal range. I mean, it would be devastating to America. And right now, there's almost no road that's going to stop that. And if that is the case, and I am right on that, these are the kinds of things that America, the politicians and the powers to be would be executing. Are you familiar with what's going on with this discussion with bilateral agreements, Charles?
Right. Yeah, I am following it closely because it ties in with some other issues I'm following, such as Triffin's paradox and so on. The elements that control having the reserve currency and whether the whole breakdown of the reserve currency.
You make a really good point on this Triffin paradox because it may be a counterbalance to the problem I just laid out because, in fact, with the Triffin paradox, it would suggest that the U.S. dollar will strengthen because you need to have one country with a large deficit for an expanding global economy. And it could be with a fear, an event, that the United States dollar may not crumble under a fiat currency, and with a fear and the Triffin paradox really to continue to work as it has happened right now. So yeah, I think there's a lot of strategy at work.
Gordon, you had a slide, the Crisis Continuum, in this show, and I'd like you to talk about that because I think that sort of lays out a potential roadmap for all these extra legal, illegitimate powers that have been grabbed by executive order.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I would like to talk about this chart I have up here now because what it's saying is this is an old game of power, and I'm grappling personally with right now what's really the essence of it all. But I do know this: the old game of power is always to create a crisis, and even Ron Emanuel, our former chief of staff for Obama, said never let a crisis go to waste. But when you have a crisis, people will demand that the government take action in whatever shape and form. And the degree and the level of that crisis and the level of anxiety that creates allows changes to be made that nobody would have allowed or even conceived of. And typically, you have different types on this continuum. You have financial crisis, and then a larger element is an economic crisis, and then a political crisis. And the financial crisis is where you have, the stock market. You have a dislocation in markets, so you feel it financially. There's an element of fear, and I'm showing fear, down below. When you have an economic crisis, it's much bigger in scale. So suddenly you're not just concerned about the money you have, you're concerned about your ability to generate income on a longer term basis, jobs. You have major dislocations in this element and the fear goes up. The next one level is really where you have political crisis, and that's where your security, that's what you're actually you fear about your own personal safety. This is the element when you get into wars, when you have a political crisis. And they all stem from economic issues, and those stem from financial issues. So there's a continuum that happens. But as that fear grows, it allows the government to grab more authority to infringe more on your constitutional rights. And people who are devotees, if you would, the elitists, who their world is about power and the execution of power, understand how to execute this. And there's many, many books that have been published on it. And once you start to lay out this continuum, you can lay into programs, each one of these 10 or 25 very key strategic programs that you would execute to make these things happen. And I'm grappling because it looks like it's right out of the textbook that this, in fact, is what is unfolding. Did I make that clear, Charles, or can you embellish on it?
I think this is a wonderful chart because it ties in the monetary policy and fiscal crises we're discussing with the potential for political crisis. And, there was a book that came out a few years ago called The Quiet Coup. I believe it was by Simon Johnson. And his thesis is that we've already had a financial coup in terms of the too big to fail banks, and the Federal Reserve have already grabbed so much power that they've actually taken over the machinery of governance. And I think that ties into your chart here. Is that really what we're talking about here is what we used to call war powers, that the executive branch has already, through these hundreds of executive orders, has grabbed what we would call war powers, equivalent to what Franklin Roosevelt had after the declaration of war in December 1941. And yet we're not at war. So this is where your chart is showing that if we've had a financial coup, then now we're moving up the scale of fear to where the political concentration of power is basically grabbing war powers, even though we're not at war.
Charles, in 2009, I drew this particular chart I'm showing now, and we were in the financial crisis at the time, and all of the things that I saw that I was worrying about, and I started a whole series of papers shown on the left here. It started at the time with the Extend and Pretend series. They're all in the public domain, and through to a whole series on the currencies and the currency wars, and another series called The Sultans of Swaps. But a roadmap that I saw unfolding of a financial, then an economic, and a political crisis, why it would unfold, and I show along the right the instruments that I thought would be the catalyst to accelerate that. And in fact, that's what's happened. With the one area now unfolding that I still see to come through 2013 is an explosion in the $700 trillion swaps marketplace that's out there. And let me repeat that for some of the listeners who may not have I'll be aware of it. We have a $700 trillion swaps marketplace, unregulated, off-balance sheet, offshore, not transacted other than between banks. And yet we have a global economy that's only $53 trillion. How could that be? And that begs the question. And when you got movements in interest rates and currencies, because these are all what they're based on, interest rate swaps and currency swaps, these can get out of bandwidths, and you could have just a tremendous issue. A cyber attack could destabilize that very, very quickly. And if that's the case, then our chart that we were just showing, Charles, of the political element would be into, if we had the internet now crashing, ATMs not working, financial transactions not being able to happen because of this cyber attack, you can imagine the grab we'd see from the power brokers at that point. Charles, we're up against our hard line. I apologize for going on there. We're going to have to wrap now. Any last comments you'd like to make on what I just said, or any of these charts?
Just one quick one, Gordon, which is that when the government grabs like the equivalent of war powers in a crisis in order to protect the citizens for a brief period of time, that's one thing. But I think what we're really talking about is these powers that have been grabbed are not given back to the legitimate constitutional powers. They remain concentrated in the executive branch, and that's what's frightening.
Could you tell our listeners how they could learn more about the writings that you do, your website, and some of the things you're working on now?
Yeah, please visit me at www.of2minds.com, and you can see my articles and books. And thank you for letting me mention that, Gordon.
This subject is probably something we should talk more about in the future, because there's literally hours of each one of these subjects we've just touched on items merit a show in itself. But again, we have to keep our show to a time that people have asked it to be. So I'll talk to you again next month.
Thank you.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at gordontlong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at gordontlong.com.